Timer, turn it on.
Turn it off. I'm turning it off.
All right, here is a story for you guys, right? Just bring it in. So here's the plan. We're going to talk about biblical manhood tonight, and I was going to have a shorter lesson. We're going to have a panel discussion. Instead, we're going to push that to next week because there's not a lot of us here tonight. So the plan is this. I'm going to give you my introduction to my message because it was very unlikely that I could manage to fit my whole lesson in 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to do my first 5 minutes of my message tonight and then pick it up next week, okay? So here's a story to start, all right? It's a story about two friends named Dee and John, okay? Here's the story. Dee grew up as the youngest of several brothers in a context where men were expected to be masculine and women to be feminine. Real men served in the military, and women typically stayed home and made babies. Dee's brothers naturally joined the military and went off to war. They were the epitome of masculinity. Dee, on the other hand, had another sort of gift. He loved to write poetry. Dee struggled with many emotions throughout his life: doubt, depression, anxiety. He also had times when he was so filled with joy he could hardly contain himself. Often, he would grab a pen and bleed his emotions onto paper. Like many poets, Dee also had a talent for writing and playing music. While his brothers were off at war, Dee stayed home and wrote poetry and music, singing songs about nature, beauty, depression, God, and his best friend John. John and Dee were inseparable. They spent loads of time together and desperately missed each other when they were apart. Dee vowed that he would spend the rest of his life with John, and John felt the same. They were not sexual with each other, but they were more than your typical American male friends. When they were together, they would laugh, they would cry, they would talk, and they would hug. A few years later, John enlisted in the military and went off to war. He rose through the ranks and was a skilled fighter, but one day, John was killed in battle. When the news reached Dee, he was devastated. He fell into a depression. He refused to eat, and he wept profusely. Once the tears dried up enough for him to see, Dee did the only thing that could soothe his pain. He took his pen and poured out his heart in a poem, describing John's love as better than the love he felt toward women. After Dee's own death, the poem would be published and read by millions. So moving and so intimate were the words of that poem that some people to this day believe that Dee and John were gay, even though they weren't. If you have not caught it by now, Dee stands for David, King David of Israel, and John is Jonathan, his friend Saul's son. I start with that story, and this I'm totally stealing this from Preston Sprinkle in his book Embodied that talks about gender, because when you read that story, when you hear about David, there are certain things about King David that sound very masculine to our ears. David was a warrior. David, cut off Goliath's head and went into war. But there are certain things that you hear that don't sound very masculine at all to our culture. David loved poetry. He was a poet. David played the harp. That doesn't sound very masculine to our culture. And it raises the question of what does it mean to be a man and what does it mean to be a woman? So in this series, Gender Confusion, why we're talking about this is this. I believe that there is a lot of confusion those bad and unhelpful stereotypes that people get sometimes confused about their gender and if they really are a guy or a girl. Or if they get confused about that for another reason, those stereotypes can make that confusion a lot worse. All right? Can make this problem and this confusion worse because of these stereotypes. And so next week, we're going to talk about what does the Bible say it means to be a man. But we're just going to look at one text tonight. And this is going to be the foundation for next week and also for when Teresa talks on biblical womanhood and what that means. Genesis 1:27 through 1:28. 1:27 through 28. All right, here's what the verses say. God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them, male and female. So quick question. Who is made in God's image? Males or females? Both. Yes, right? He created humankind in God's image. He created them, male and female, in his image. God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Whose job is it to subdue the earth, males or females? Both. Rule the fish of the sea. Whose job is it to rule? Both. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. All right. So, this is just the beginning of the answer. Okay. What does it mean to be male or female? What does it mean to be a man, or what does it mean to be a woman? According to Genesis 1:27 through 28, both men and women are created in God's image. Okay? That's the starting point. It's not that one is better than the other. Actually, both reflect God in a special and unique way. Both are created in God's image. Both men and women were called to rule creation together. Right? Subdue and rule over creation together. Both men and women together doing it. And the last piece is this, and this is what we're going to build on and discuss further in coming weeks, is that in the original creation, gender and sex were equivalent. Okay? What I mean by that is gender, your identity as a man or a woman, and sex, the parts you were born with, your biology, whether you're male or female, were one and the same. Okay? There's no differentiation between those. So if you're born as a male, that means you are a man. If you're born as a female, you are a woman. Now, this brings up questions that we're going to talk about. What about if you don't feel like a man or feel like a woman? This whole question of gender dysphoria. But for now, I want you to see, at least in the original creation, these were one and the same. God created male and female both to reflect his glory. And my contention is this, that a lot of the gender confusion comes from stereotypes, not from the inherent idea of what it means to be a male or female, or a man or a woman. And that those stereotypes are actually what causes a lot of confusion. Guys who don't like trucks, but do like baking cakes and decorating cakes, in our culture, that can sound like a feminine thing. But biblically, it's a hard case to say that that's culturally not what it means to be a man. So, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? That's what we're going to be talking about. But for now, I just want you to understand, both male and female are created in God's image. Both are called to rule over the earth and subdue it. And in the original creation, biological sex, what you were born as, went together and integrated with your gender identity. How you identified yourself and felt about yourself. All right? So, that's it. Questions of clarification before we do something totally different in the next. Oh my goodness, I totally forgot. All right, let me pray, and then we will do something totally different. God, thank you that you created us complex beings. God, thank you for the way you created us. I pray in this series as we dig in and dive into all the complex questions this brings up. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What do we do if we're experiencing confusion? What do we do and how do we respond to friends who are experiencing confusion? God, I pray that you would give us wisdom and you would give us love. And you would give us honesty and grace. We ask this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right. Mac, you can end stream. We'll call it a night. We'll pick it back up here next.